There is a moment, quiet and invisible to the rest of the world, when a person sitting in a doctor's office stops being who they were just 5 minutes ago. No bell rings. No door closes. The light in the room is still the same light. The chair is still the same chair. But something has shifted at the center of everything, and there is no going back to the person who walked in. For most people, that moment stays private. It belongs to them, to their family, to the four walls of a room that no one else will ever see. Catherine, Princess of Wales, did not get that. She is one of the most recognized women on earth, photographed at every turn, written about in every language, watched by hundreds of millions of people who feel they know her even though they have never met her. When her moment came, the world was already watching, already wondering, already talking. And what she did with that moment, how she chose to step forward, to speak, to be honest in a world that often rewards silence, became something far bigger than a royal announcement. It became a story about what it means to be human when the ground disappears beneath your feet. It began in January 2024. Catherine was admitted to the London clinic for what was described, at first, as planned abdominal surgery. The details were kept private, and the public was told that her recovery would take several weeks. This, in itself, was not alarming. People have surgeries. They recover. Life goes on. But weeks passed. The princess did not appear. Her diary of public engagements stayed empty. William stepped back from some of his own duties to be at home. The palace remained quiet in a way that felt different from its usual careful silence. Something was happening inside those walls, inside that family, that the world was not being told. The speculation that followed was extraordinary. In an age when social media can take a single unanswered question and build it into a mountain of noise within hours, the internet did exactly that. Wild theories spread. Unfounded rumors grew legs and ran. People who had never met Catherine and never would debated her health, her whereabouts, her life, as though they had every right to know. Some of it was simply curiosity. Some of it was something uglier, a hunger for drama that did not stop to consider that a real woman and her real family were on the other side of all of it. Then came March 2024. Catherine chose to speak herself. Not through a palace spokesperson. Not through a carefully worded statement released on letterhead. She sat in front of a camera in a garden, with the green of England behind her, and she looked into the lens and told the world what had happened. Cancer had been found following her surgery. She was undergoing a course of preventative chemotherapy. She was working through this with her medical team. She asked for privacy, especially for her children George, Charlotte, and Louis, who needed to be shielded as much as possible from what their mother was going through. The world stopped. Not metaphorically. In the real way that only happens a few times in a decade, when something breaks through the noise, when the scroll stops, when people put down what they were doing and felt something genuine and shared. The video spread everywhere within minutes. It was watched and rewatched. It was not a carefully managed royal performance. It was a woman, clearly tired, clearly carrying something enormous, choosing honesty over the easier path of indefinite silence. What she said mattered. What she did not say also mattered. She never named the type of cancer. That was her right. A diagnosis is among the most private things a person can possess, and the fact that she was a princess did not change that. She gave the world enough, the truth of her situation, the reason for her absence, the confirmation that she was fighting, without surrendering every detail of her medical life to public consumption. That choice, to be honest and private at the same time, took more courage than most people recognized. What followed was a long stretch of months that belonged almost entirely to her family and her treatment. Catherine withdrew from public duties. The children were kept at home, away from cameras. William attended engagements when he could, but it was clear that his first job, the one that mattered most to him, was inside the house in Windsor. Sources close to the family described a household that was holding itself together with love and, with effort, 3 young children being raised with as much normalcy as anyone could manage while their mother was undergoing chemotherapy and their father was also heir to the throne of a country still adjusting to a new king. Chemotherapy is not gentle. There is nothing soft about what it does to a body. It is a calculated assault, designed to destroy what is dangerous at the cost of also exhausting what is healthy. People who have gone through it describe the fatigue as unlike anything they have ever experienced, not the tired that sleep fixes, but a deep, cellular depletion that sits behind the eyes and in the bones and does not lift. The nausea. The days when even sitting upright feels like more than the body can manage. The strange grief that comes with watching your own hair change, your face change, your reflection become someone slightly unfamiliar. Catherine went through all of it while 3 children watched and worried, while a husband tried to hold everything together, while a country waited, and while the world continued to speculate about things that were none of its business. There were small, carefully managed glimpses during those months. She was photographed briefly, caught in a car, or seen from a distance. The palace said very little. Those close to her were protective in a way that said more than words could. When Trooping the Colour came in June 2024, the great summer parade in honor of the king's official birthday, Catherine appeared in a carriage with her children, and, when she entered the royal box at Wimbledon that July, the crowd rose as one. A standing ovation from the English summer, from people who had been holding something in their chests for months and, finally, had somewhere to put it. She was thinner. She was clearly still in the middle of something hard. But she was there. She was upright. She was wearing a soft smile and, holding the hand of her daughter Charlotte, and the world, which had been a little frightened, let out a breath it had not realized it was holding. That summer stretched on. Treatment continued. The palace said nothing beyond what was necessary. And Catherine, inside the private world she had drawn a careful line around, was doing the hardest thing. She was not performing recovery. She was living it, with all the unglamorous, exhausting, frightening reality of what that actually looks like when the cameras are off and the curtains are closed and it is just you and your body and the long work of getting through one more day. September 2024 brought the next update. She had finished chemotherapy. The announcement came with a video filmed in a garden at her home in Windsor. Catherine sat among wildflowers and spoke directly and clearly. Chemotherapy was behind her. But she was careful, in the way that only someone who has truly been through it can be, not to say that everything was fine. She said that her path to healing was long. She said she would continue to take each day as it came. She said she was looking forward to returning to work, but she did not rush it. She did not wave and say all clear because that was not what was true. What was true was that one chapter had closed and another, harder to define, had begun. The world heard what it wanted to hear. She finished treatment, she is recovering, everything will return to normal. And the world was not entirely wrong. But it was not entirely right either. There is a version of recovery that happens in test results and scan readings and doctor appointments. And then, there is another version, the one nobody talks about enough, that happens in the body and the mind long after the final infusion, long after the port is removed, long after the clinical team signs off and says the treatment has done its work. That version was just beginning. But none of that was visible yet. What was visible was a woman who had walked through something terrifying and was still standing. Still present. Still willing to look at the world and say, I am here. The pink rose she planted at the RHS Wellbeing Garden at Colchester Hospital, a rose the Royal Horticultural Society named after her, Catherine's rose, would bloom long after the moment was over. She pressed it into the soil with her own hands. A gesture, she said, rooted in hope and care. It was rooted in something more personal than that. It was the act of a woman who had been through fire, pressing something living into the earth, and trusting it to grow. There is a thing that happens after the danger passes that nobody warns you about. The treatment ends. The appointments space out. The people who gathered close begin to step back to their own lives, because the emergency seems to be over. And you are supposed to feel relief. You are supposed to feel the weight lift. You are supposed to wake up one morning and recognize yourself again in the mirror and think, that chapter is done. I survived it. I can move forward now. But the body does not read from the same script as the mind. And the mind, shaped by months of fear and vigilance, does not simply switch off because a doctor gives good news. Recovery, real recovery, the kind that happens in the weeks and months and years after the last round of treatment, is not a straight line. It is not a triumphant march back to the person you were before. It is something messier and quieter and more complicated than that. And Catherine, Princess of Wales, understood this better than most people were ready to hear. January 14, 2025. She walked into the Royal Marsden Hospital in London, the hospital where she had received her treatment, one of the most respected cancer centers in the world, and she did not arrive as a patient this time. She arrived as a patron. As someone standing on the other side of a door she had once been terrified to walk through. She wore a coat the color of a clear winter sky, and she smiled at the staff and the doctors and the nurses who had spent the past year helping to keep her alive, and she sat with patients who were still in the middle of their own battles, and she held space for them in the way that only someone who has genuinely been there can. Then, she shared the news the world had been waiting for. She was in remission. 2 words. Clean and enormous and heavy with everything they carried. She wrote them herself, signed the message with her initial C, so people would know the words were hers, not the palace's, not a spokesperson's. She wrote, "It is a relief to now be in remission and I remain focused on recovery." She wrote that it takes time to adjust to a new normal. She said she was looking forward to a fulfilling year ahead. She said there was much to look forward to. And then, she thanked the hospital. Thanked the staff. Thanked, in the most personal terms she had yet used publicly, everyone who had walked quietly alongside her and William through everything. She said the care they had received had been exceptional. She said they could not have asked for more. The world responded the way it responds when something genuinely good happens to someone it has been quietly worrying about for nearly a year. There was relief. There were tears from people who had never met her. There was the particular kind of warmth that comes when a story that has been sitting in the chest, heavy with uncertainty, finally turns a corner. People who had held their breath for months let it go. But Catherine, even in that moment of good news, did not pretend it was over. She had stood in the hospital that day and talked to a patient who was currently undergoing chemotherapy, and she had told her honestly, "It's really tough. It's such a shock." She had remembered what it was like to sit in that chair. She had not forgotten the weight of that initial diagnosis, what she called the uncertainty of it, the sheer volume of information that crashes down on a person in those first hours, the way the mind has to scramble to catch up to what the body has already been told. She had not distanced herself from that person in the chair by standing too tall or speaking in careful, managed phrases. She had sat close. She had told the truth about how hard it was. And then, she had also carried herself with the quiet assurance of someone who had made it through. That combination, honesty and steadiness held at the same time, was becoming the signature of how Catherine moved through this whole experience. She did not perform strength. She was not performing anything. She simply refused to say things that were not true, and she refused to let fear be the only thing anyone saw. In the months that followed her remission announcement, something interesting happened. Catherine began, slowly and deliberately, to return to the world. Not in a rush. Not in a way that suggested she had forgotten what the past year had cost her. The palace was careful. Her team was careful. Those close to her were clear that she would return at the pace that was right for her, no faster, no matter what the external pressure might be. A senior aide described it as a balancing act. Getting the drumbeat right. She began to show up. A visit here. An engagement there. She attended events connected to the causes she cared most about: early childhood development, the well-being of families, the quiet and often underfunded work of helping young children get the start in life that shapes everything that comes after. These were not glamorous engagements. They were working visits, the kind that involve sitting in a room with practitioners and researchers and parents and listening carefully, asking real questions, leaving with something to think about. Catherine had always done this work seriously, even when the cameras suggested the clothes mattered more than the content. Now she returned to it with something additional, the perspective of someone who had spent a year being profoundly cared for by the medical system and now wanted to give something back. In June 2025, she attended Trooping the Color again. This time the carriage ride and the balcony appearance and the ease with which she held herself told a different story than the year before. The year before, she had been thin and careful and clearly still fragile. This year there was something more settled about her. Not finished, she herself had been clear that recovery was not finished, but more present. More like the woman the world had watched before January 2024 introduced an entirely new chapter into her life. Then came July 2025, and a visit that would become one of the most talked about moments of her recovery in a completely different way. She went to Colchester Hospital in Essex to visit the RHS Wellbeing Garden, a garden built in the belief that green things and growing things and the smell of soil and the weight of sunlight can help people heal in ways that medicine alone cannot reach. She planted roses there, Catherine's roses, named after her by the Royal Horticultural Society. She walked among the beds. She spoke with NHS staff and volunteers. She spoke with patients. And she told the truth in a way she had not told it quite so directly before. She said that when treatment ends, there is this instinct to think that you can simply crack on. Get back to normal. Pick up where you left off. She said that the reality is completely different. She described the phase after treatment as really, really difficult, not just difficult, but really, really, the doubling of the word doing something that single words cannot do. She talked about how the brave face you put on through treatment, the stoicism, the focus, the pure survival mode of just getting through each round drops away when the treatment stops. And, suddenly, the body and the mind have to reckon with everything they had been holding at arm's length. She said she could not function normally at home the way she once had. This was not the language of a palace statement. This was the language of a person who had actually been through something and was willing to say what it had cost her in terms that the woman down the street, going through the same thing with none of the resources and none of the support network, could recognize. She used the phrase roller coaster. She said it is not a smooth plane, which you expect it to be. The reality, she said, is that you go through hard times. You go through better times. It moves in waves and not in a straight line toward normal. This honesty, delivered quietly, in a hospital garden, to a group of patients and volunteers, rippled outward further than she may have intended. Because what Catherine was describing is something millions of cancer survivors carry and often carry alone. The assumption from the outside world is that when treatment ends, the hard part is over. The assumption from the inside is that the hard part, in some ways, is just beginning. There is the loss of the clinical structure that has been holding you. There is the body's slow reckoning with what it has been through. There is the identity shift, the question of who you are now, of how you carry what you know. There is the rebuilding, which is not dramatic, which does not look like anything from the outside, which just takes time and quiet and the kind of support that is hard to ask for and harder to sustain. Catherine named all of it. Not in a speech. Not in a carefully prepared statement. In a garden, in July, pressing her hands into the soil around the roots of a rose that bore her name. Her brother, James Middleton, spoke around this time about watching his sister through everything that had happened. He said he was in awe of her. Not in the way that someone says I'm proud of her because it seems like the right thing to say. He said that through everything, she was still the same person he had grown up with. That the experience had not changed who she was at her core, that the woman who had faced the diagnosis and the treatment and the long slow rebuilding afterward was still, recognizably, his sister. The same person. Just carrying something new. That observation landed quietly, but it landed hard. Because identity, who we are through the worst of it, whether the worst of it changes us into someone unrecognizable even to ourselves, is one of the deepest fears that illness brings. And, to be told by the person who has known you your whole life that you are still you, that you made it through intact, is one of the most profound things anyone can say. By the autumn of 2025, Catherine was giving her first public speech since the diagnosis. At the Future Workforce Summit in London in November, she stood before a room of business leaders and advocates and spoke about early childhood development with the precision and passion of someone who had been building this work for years and had not let a cancer diagnosis slow the thinking even when it had slowed everything else. She was clear. She was focused. She was present in a way that filled the room. A royal expert who watched described her return to this work as a sign of who Catherine truly is, that she does not make speeches often, and, when she does, the choice of subject tells you what she actually cares about. She did not choose a glamorous return. She chose the unglamorous, important work. The kind that will not make the front page but will shape the lives of thousands of children who will never know her name. She planted a rose. She gave a speech. She told the truth in a hospital garden. She sat with a chemotherapy patient and said, quietly and honestly, I know. It's really tough. And, somewhere in the doing of all of that, quietly and without fanfare, Catherine was building her new normal, not back to what it was, because that was gone, but forward into something that had been earned through a year of the hardest work a person can do. There is a particular kind of courage that doesn't make the headlines. It is not the courage of the dramatic announcement or the carefully filmed message in the garden. It is not the courage of the moment when the world finds out and holds its breath. That kind of courage is real, but it has an audience. It happens in front of people. It is witnessed and recorded and replayed. The other kind happens in the dark, in the ordinary hours, in the ordinary days that are not filmed and not celebrated and not counted as a milestone by anyone except the person living through them. It is the courage of the second cup of tea when the first one was already an effort. The courage of the school run, of the homework table, of the Tuesday evening that looks exactly like every other Tuesday evening except that your body is still putting itself back together from the inside and nobody can see it and there is no trophy for making it to Wednesday. That is the courage Catherine lived for more than a year, and it is the courage that very few people talked about when they talked about her story. By January 2026, Catherine had reached a milestone that she had not made a great noise about but that carried enormous weight in the quiet way that real things do. 1 year since she had announced her remission. A full year of living on the other side of that word, not inside the treatment, not inside the worst of the uncertainty, but in the long and complicated territory that follows. She was 44 years old. She was a wife and a mother of 3 and a princess of Wales and a woman who had navigated something that most of the world had watched from a safe distance, and she had navigated it without losing herself. The year had not been without difficulty. She had said so herself, in the garden in Colchester and in the quiet conversations at hospitals and events that filtered back through those who were there. The recovery had been real and it had been hard and it had not followed the smooth upward line that people imagined from the outside. There were good days and worse days. There were days when functioning normally felt possible and days when it didn't. The body that had been through chemotherapy was still in the long work of repair, and that work did not stop when the calendar turned or when the public profile returned or when the photographs showed her smiling in a summer garden. But something was also genuinely, meaningfully better. Not just managed better or performed better. Actually better. At the start of 2026, on her 44th birthday in January, Catherine shared something that was entirely her own. She released the final installment of her Mother Nature video series, a project she had created and carried through the past year as a deeply personal reflection on how the natural world had helped her heal. She had built it quietly, away from the noise, as a creative act that was both private in its origin and public in its intention. She wrote about it herself, in the message she attached to the final video, signing it with her initials C the way she had signed the remission announcement the year before, so that no one would mistake these words for anyone else's. She wrote that the series had been a deeply personal, creative reflection on how nature had helped her heal. But, she said it was also something larger, a story about the power of nature and creativity in collective healing. Not just her healing. The word collective doing something important, reaching past her own experience toward the experience of everyone who had watched, who had recognized something in her story that belonged to their own. She wrote that there is so much we can learn from the natural world, as we try to build something healthier and happier. These were not the words of a woman who had come through an illness and emerged unchanged. These were the words of a woman who had been through fire and come out on the other side with a different kind of clarity about what matters, about where meaning lies, about the relationship between what we can control and what we have to surrender to, and how nature, in its absolute indifference to human schedule and human anxiety, offers something that nothing else quite can. The Mother Nature series was never just a project. It was the creative record of a year of healing. It was Catherine's way of processing, in the only way that is real to her, not through press releases or televised announcements, but through images and music and the texture of living things, through mornings in the garden and afternoons watching the way light moves through trees and the way a year turns from bare to full to bare again, as it always has, as it will keep doing, as it does not wait for anyone to be ready before it moves on. In the early weeks of 2026, she and William visited Charing Cross Hospital in West London. It was a working visit, not a symbolic appearance, but the kind of engagement that involves actually sitting with people and hearing what they are working on and asking the kind of questions that show you have been thinking about this before you walked in the door. She moved through the wards with the ease of someone who no longer feels like a visitor in medical spaces. The past year had changed her relationship to hospitals, to illness, to the language that doctors use and the way patients sit in chairs and the particular silence of rooms where people are fighting for something. She had been in those chairs. She knew that silence. There was a moment she shared during that visit, casual, unrehearsed, the kind of thing that does not make it into the formal record but that the people in the room carry home with them. She told a member of staff, speaking about her time as a patient at the Royal Marsden, that she had become so attached to her chemotherapy port that she had been almost reluctant to have it removed when the time came. She said it half laughing, in that way that is both funny and entirely serious at the same time. Because the port is the machine of survival. It is the line through which the medicine enters the body. And, when it is removed, it signals that this particular fight is over, which is good news, which is what you wanted, which you should be relieved about, and yet the removal of it also feels like losing a tether to something that kept you alive. That ambivalence is real. It is strange and contradictory and completely human. And she said it out loud, in a hospital ward, to a member of staff who recognized it immediately. This was Catherine's particular gift, the one she had always had but that the past year had sharpened into something more precise. She had always been good with people. She had always been the kind of royal who does not move through rooms with careful distance, but who leans in, who makes eye contact, who asks the second question after the first. But now she brought something additional to those rooms. She brought the authority of experience. When she sat with a cancer patient and said it's really tough, it's such a shock, she was not saying it as someone who had read the literature or been briefed by a medical team. She was saying it as someone who had sat in the same chair. That is a different kind of presence entirely. It cannot be performed and it cannot be faked and it cannot be learned from a briefing document. It comes only from having been there. The Royal Marsden had made her and William joint patrons. This was not honorary. Catherine had spoken about what she hoped to do in that role, supporting groundbreaking research, promoting patient and family well-being, helping to transform the experience of every person impacted by cancer. These are large ambitions. They require sustained effort and genuine engagement over years, not the occasional visit and a photograph. She understood this. The people at the hospital understood this. The commitment was real. And, in the background, quieter than all of it, the work she had always cared about most was continuing. Early childhood development. The science of what happens in the first years of a child's life and how those years shape everything that follows. The advocacy for families who do not have the resources to give their children what they need in those critical early years. The research and the summits and the long, unglamorous push to make policymakers and business leaders understand that this is not a soft issue, not a women's issue, not a charity concern, but the single most important investment any society can make in its own future. She had not let cancer take this from her. She had been too ill to appear publicly for months, but the thinking had not stopped. The work being done by the teams she had assembled had not stopped. And, when she returned to it with a renewed sense of urgency that those around her described as striking, as though the experience of confronting her own mortality had clarified something about what she wanted to leave behind, about what she believed her work was for. What Catherine built in the year between her remission announcement and her 44th birthday was something that does not have a clean name. It was not a recovery in the simple sense of the word. It was not a return to what she had been before, because that person, the one who walked into a hospital in January 2024 not knowing what the surgery would find, was gone. Not in a tragic way. In the way that every person who has been through something serious is gone from who they were before it. Changed by the experience into someone who knows things they did not know, who carries things they did not carry, who sees the ordinary days differently. What Catherine built was a life that held both things at once. The grief of what the year had cost her and the genuine gratitude for what it had given her. The honest acknowledgement that recovery is hard and ongoing, and the equally honest forward-leaning hope that the next year holds something worth moving toward. The willingness to say, in a garden or a hospital ward or in a personal message on social media, here is what it was really like, here is what I am still working through, here is what I believe about the power of support and community and the green and growing world to help people heal. She pressed a rose into the earth in Colchester and said it was a gesture rooted in hope and care. A rose named after a woman who was diagnosed with cancer and chose not to disappear. Who chose, instead, to be honest in the way that cost something, to return to the work she believed in, to sit with people in the middle of their own hard moments and offer them the only thing she truly had to offer, the truth of her own experience. The rose will bloom again this spring, as it did last year, as it will next year. In hospital gardens across the United Kingdom, in the quiet places where people go to breathe and to sit outside and to feel the sun and to remind themselves that living things do not wait for perfect conditions before they grow. Catherine, Princess of Wales, turned 44 in January 2026. She was in remission. She was still in recovery. She was still working, still showing up, still signing her messages with a single letter to make sure the world knew the words were hers. She was here. That is the whole story. And it is also, in the best possible way, still being written.